Hey everybody, my name is Alex, and in this video we are going to do part 3 of our ultimate autonomous guide. We will be setting up and running our node. So I have the Substack article here that we'll be following. There's some tips and tricks at the start here. Just a few things we'll go over before we get going. You must forward the ports to the node in order to get enough peers and have a reliable connection. If you're not 100% sure on how to forward the ports, I briefly go over it in the next section, but I recommend Googling the model of your router or modem, and typically there's instructions online on how to forward your ports. You're also going to need at least 100 gigabytes of space to store the blockchain data. The node can be deployed on the same computer as your cluster. I'm going to be deploying it on a separate PC, so it's going to be all by itself on my Johnny 5 PC, and then the cluster is going to be on Terminator, but I will briefly cover how you can just install it all together when we get to the cluster section. So it's fine whether you're going to be joining the node with your cluster or you're going to be having them separate. I will cover how to get them working all together in the cluster section. So you can just follow this guide normally, like regardless of however your setup is actually going to be. So forwarding your ports, the idea is from outside your network, traffic needs to be forwarded to the correct ports for whatever PC it has the application running on that port. So you can see, I'll open up, I'm using a Unified Dream Machine Pro. So for me, it's pretty easy. I can just click in here, create entry, and I'll just put in, the name. I'm going to say subspace. This should really be Autonomys, but I forwarded these a long time ago. And from anywhere, so outside the network, coming basically from anywhere, going to port 30333, it's going to forward to the machine that is running my node on 3333, and then the same basically for 3433. So the idea is you just need to forward those ports to the correct IP address, and the IP address will be the computer that's running the node. So if you remember, you can run that hostname -I, capital I command, and you can get the IP address. You probably already have it because you're SSHing into it, but you need to use that IP address. And these are the only ports that you're going to need to forward. Okay, so once you've forwarded your ports, and you can do this after you launch the node, but you should do this as quickly as possible. You're probably going to run into issues, and typically, if you don't forward your ports, you're going to have a lot less peers. So if you're noticing you don't get up to like 40 peers, and it could take a couple hours to get to 40 peers, but if you're noticing that you have low peers like under 10, it's probably you didn't forward your ports correctly. Okay, so on all the computers that we run, either the node or clusters, we're going to create a network for Autonomys. And we're just going to do that on Docker. So in Docker, you can create tons of networks. We're going to create one dedicated to Autonomys, and we're going to do that so we can set some static IP addresses, and it makes it a lot easier to keep things consistent. Because if you let the IP addresses get assigned dynamically or you're mixing networks, it can sometimes get really confusing. So we're just going to create a network and we're going to call it Autonomous Network. And you need to do that on all of the PCs that you're going to run any of this stuff on. So for at least for the node, initially, we're going to create the network. And then if there's another PC, like from my case where I'm running on another PC with the cluster, I will create the network also on that. So I'll call it out when we get to the farming section, but this is going to be the first step. So you can just copy the command here, and let's go into Johnny 5, and I'm just going to paste this command and hit enter and put in my password, and you should get the container ID here. Now, if we go back to, okay, actually, let's go back into the terminal. We can do docker network ls, and we can see that I've created the autonomous network. But we can also in Portainer, if we are, I'm in Johnny 5, and that's what I was SSH'd into when I created the network. I can go to networks and I can see the autonomous network here as well. And we can see we'll be running everything on 172.25.0 and then whatever the rest of the IP is. So that's just two ways to make sure that it's actually correctly created. And then really we're just going to be running the node from here. And so it'll be really just a copy paste thing. You're going to need to change a few things, but I'll point those out for you. So in Portainer, if you're at the home, you want to go to whatever environment you're going to be deploying the node on. For me, that's going to be Johnny 5. And then you're going to click Stacks. And it's on the left-hand side here too. There's also a menu item for Stacks, but you're going to click Stacks and then Add Stack. And I call it Autonomous Node because that I'm just going to be deploying a node in this stack file. I'm not going to be deploying my entire cluster. If you're putting everything in one, you can just call it like Autonomous Cluster or something like that. But I'm going to do node just because it's only the node that's going to be running. And one other thing I want to cover, I'm running it's from 2021. It's a Celeron processor, but it's like a low powered one. It doesn't work with the default images. I actually had to compile my own images or build my own images. And you may run into this as well, especially if you're running an older PC or you're running like a mini PC like I am for your node, you might have to build your own image. So if you run into, I'll show you basically what happens if I use just the default image. I'll show you, that it doesn't work. And if you run into the same issue, I think it's part 8. So a couple more, I have to get through a couple more parts, but in part 8, I'm going to be going over how to build the image so that you can basically build the image for whatever CPU hardware that you have. So when I actually deploy this, you're going to see I use the custom image that I built. But when you do this, if you have a modern processor, you can probably just use the default image that Autonomous creates. So we already did the add stack. We already put the name in here. And I'm going to copy and paste this in here. It's not going to work for me, but if I just paste that into the web editor, and these two are optional, so you don't need dash dash listen on or dash dash dsn dash listen dash on. And if you can see, these are the ports that we forwarded, but these are the default ports. If you are going to keep those ports the same, and the reason why you might change them is maybe there's a conflict. You might be running something else that's on those ports. Maybe you're running multiple nodes for some reason. You can change those ports so that there's not a conflict on that port. So if you're running the default ones, you can remove them. But if you're running a non-default port, you would need to change it here and you would need to change it here. And the reason why we have to keep it up here is because this is what's telling Docker that we need to expose these ports for this Docker image. So I'm going to delete these because I don't need them. I'm going to be running the default. At the time of this article, Gemini 3H 2024, September 3rd is the latest image, and make sure to update that based on whatever the current one is. And we might not even be in 3H, we might be like mainnet or something by the time you go through this. So just make sure you're using, if you're in Discord, you can see the latest version in the release announcements channel, but you can also go to the website, the autonomous.xyz website, and see what the latest version is. Okay, and then you're going to want to change the name down here. I just put a default value in there, hey hardware_guide, but you can put it whatever you want. There's a website where you can actually go and like see metrics about your node, and you would search by this name. So name it something unique. Just by default, I put hey hardware_guide. And then this label section, this is specifically for Spaceport. Spaceport is an application that I built. It's not required, so if you don't plan to use Spaceport, you can delete that. This is basically just adding a friendly name so that you can, when it's displayed in the monitoring application, it's easy to understand like what it is. 'Cause otherwise, it's going to pull in this autonomous underscore node, which is like, I don't like the underscores in there. And then you're going to want to update the environment time zone. That's just so everything is kind of like in your time zone and it all makes sense. And then we're going to be adding an external network, which is the autonomous network that we created earlier. And we're going to be creating a volume called node data. And we're going to be mounting this up here. So we're going to be mounting node data to the folder inside the container var subspace. And you can see for the base path, we also have var subspace. So basically we're pointing this base path to the node data volume that we create. And that's really it. That's everything that you need to know for deploying an autonomous node. So let me just show you what happens. This isn't going to work for me, but I'll click deploy stack. And it takes a couple seconds because that's to download the images and then deploy it. And I go in here and it looks like it's running, right? But if I click logs, it just says no log line matching the filter. Basically, nothing's happening. And the reason why is because if I go back into editor, restart unless stopped is set. What that means is it's just going to continuously restart. So it's going to look like it's working, but it's not. So if I remove that and I click update the stack, so now if it fails, it's not going to restart. It's just going to exit. So if we just wait for a second here, give it a refresh, we can see exited code 132. This basically means that the image isn't compatible with the system architecture. And if we go and click our log, again, we've got nothing here. So if I go to images, I've already built a autonomous custom node. That is one that I built earlier for this specific computer. So instead, and you'll have to build this again, it's part 8 probably, where I'll go over how to build a custom image for your hardware. But in this example for my stack file, I'm going to just replace this with my custom image. And then I'll click update the stack, click update, and now we see it's working just fine. Now there's one thing else I want to, I'll update it later, but basically I need to re-add the restart unless stopped thing right here, but I'll do it later just so that this node starts syncing. So once you launch it, you'll see it's still starting, but it's actually like if you go into the logs, you can see that it's initializing everything. It's getting everything all set up and it's going to start syncing. Now, snap sync, which is what a feature that allows your node to sync to the latest block very quickly. It takes about 7 to 15 minutes, depending on your system and your connection. But initially, you're just going to see syncing. And it might say 0.0 blocks per second. This is the target. This is what we're trying to get to, the target block. And then this best is what you're currently at, 0. So and this telemetry error is normal. Don't worry about it. Everybody gets it, I'm pretty sure. I always get it. It'll work fine without it. But you're going to see best is going to be 0. And it was like this for like 7 minutes for me. And then all of a sudden it jumped up to like 95% synced. So just wait a little bit. You should see your peers growing though. If your peers stay at 0, either there's some sort of network issue that's blocking your connection or you don't have port forwarding set up correctly. This peers should grow. And it takes some time, but you should get to 40 peers. That's like what you should expect. And let's see what else we have to go over here. We talked about what we need to update. We talked about the snap sync. Okay, so in this image, I can't really make it bigger, but that's kind of bigger. You can see this is the point in which it does the snap sync. So there's this massive like 632,000 blocks per second. And then I get pretty close. So I'm at 316 and the highest target is 318. So I'm pretty close. And then you can see I'm only at 11 peers, but it starts after that syncing to get to the fully synced portion. So that's what the snap sync looks like. It took 7 minutes for me. And let's see. Yeah, that's really it. So what you're going to want to, and these warnings are pretty normal. I get this every single time I start a node, so don't worry about it too much. If you get some warns, as long as you got peers and as long as you eventually have that snap sync activate, everything is fine. The next section, well, actually the section after the next section is when we set up our cluster. And again, you're either going to be setting it up on a separate PC or the PC that you set up your node on. It doesn't matter. This tutorial is the same, but you're going to need to know if you're setting your cluster up on a separate PC, you need to know the IP address of where your node is set up. And that's not, if we go into containers, that's not this IP address. It's going to be the IP address of the computer. So Johnny5, let's see, is actually where Portainer is hosted. So for me, it's going to be this IP address. So just take note of the IP address wherever you have your node set up if it's going to be on a different PC. Okay, so that's really it for setting up a node. In the next video, we're going to go over how to prep the drives so that we can eventually run the cluster and start plotting and farming those drives. So hopefully this was helpful. I'll see you in the next one.